What does silence look like? In a crowded, echoing courtroom, silence can look like guilt. It can look like defeat. For Clarice Vance, a 26-year-old woman with no family and no connections, her silence on the witness stand was a confession to the world. She sat mute as the prosecution dismantled her life, as her boss painted her as a thief, and as the jury declared her guilty. She was led away in handcuffs, a nobody, lost to the system. But in the back of that same courtroom, a man in $1,000 suit watched, not seeing guilt, but seeing a test that was about to unlock a multi-billion-dollar empire. Because Clarice's silence wasn't an admission, it was an audition. The New York County Courthouse on Center Street is a monument to consequence. Its stone floors, worn smooth by a century of anxious footsteps, smelled of old polish and stale coffee. On the 8th floor, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit courtroom 8-day, Clarice Vance sat at the defense table, feeling invisible. She was a ghost in a navy blue suit, the only one she owned, purchased from a thrift store for this very occasion. It was 2 sizes too large, and she swam in it. Her public defender, a perpetually exhausted man named David Harrison, was shuffling papers he knew were useless. "They're going to the jury, Clarice," he whispered, his voice rough. "This is your last chance. You take the stand, you show some remorse, you explain something. Right now, your silence is killing us." Clarice looked at him. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were devoid of tears. She was past tears. She had been on trial for 3 weeks, accused of embezzling $1.2 million from Thorne Analytics, the mid-level data firm where she'd worked as a junior accounts manager. Her boss, the charismatic and cruel Marcus Thorne, sat in the front row of the gallery. He looked impeccable, in a custom-tailored Xenia suit, his silver hair catching the light. He had spent the last 2 days on the stand, painting a masterful picture of a bright, troubled young woman he had taken under his wing, who had then betrayed him, using her access to siphon funds into untraceable offshore accounts. It was all a lie. A brilliant, intricate, and damning lie. "I have nothing to say," Clarice whispered back to Harrison, her voice dry. "But you're innocent," he'd hissed at her a week ago. "Does it matter?" she'd replied. And that simple, defeated question had hung in the air between them ever since. The evidence Thorne had fabricated was perfect. Emails she had supposedly sent, digital transfers authorized by her user ID, even a recorded phone call, a deep fake, Harrison had argued, to no avail, where her voice was heard discussing a transfer. She was a foster kid with a GED and 2 years of community college. He was a celebrated tech entrepreneur with connections all over the city. It was her word against his, and she knew, with the cold certainty of a life lived on the bottom rung, whose word would be believed. So she chose silence. She refused to participate in the theater. She would not beg. She would not cry. She would not invent a new story to counter his. If the world was determined to see her as a thief, she would not give it the satisfaction of a performance. Her silence was the only thing she had left that was truly her own. "The jury has reached a verdict," the bailiff announced. Clarice's heart didn't pound. It just sank. A heavy, cold stone dropping into an empty well. The 12 jurors filed in, their faces grim, refusing to make eye contact with her. Harrison placed a hand on her arm, a gesture of comfort that felt more like he was bracing himself. In the back row of the gallery, a man sat perfectly still. He had been there every day, never spoke, never so much as rustled a paper. He was older, in his late 60s, with a face like carved granite and eyes that missed nothing. He wore a Brioni suit that cost more than Clarice's entire life earnings. His name was Arthur Pendleton, and he was the only person in the room, other than Clarice and Thorne, who knew the truth. He watched Clarice, his expression unreadable, as the jury foreman stood. On the charge of grand larceny in the 1st degree, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of falsifying business records, how do you find? Guilty. A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. Marcus Thorne allowed himself a small, sad smile, a mask of vindicated grief. David Harrison dropped his head into his hands. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Maria Chen, looked at Clarice. Ms. Vance, do you have anything to say before I schedule sentencing? This was it. The last moment. Clarice looked at the American flag hanging limply to the judge's right. She looked at the jury who had just condemned her. She looked at Marcus Thorne, who had just destroyed her, and she said nothing. Her silence was vast. It filled the room, heavy and uncomfortable. It was defiant and broken all at once. Judge Chen sighed, a flicker of irritation crossing her features. Very well. Sentencing will be in 2 days. The defendant is remanded into custody. The bailiff moved toward her with handcuffs. The click of the metal was the loudest sound Clarice had ever heard. As she was led out, her gaze drifted to the back of the courtroom. She locked eyes with the man in the Brioni suit. Arthur Pendleton didn't look away. He simply watched her, his expression a perfect, neutral mask. Then, he ever so slightly nodded. Not in agreement, not in sympathy. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of completion. Clarice was led away, the steel door of the courtroom closing behind her, shutting out the world. The trial of Clarice Vance was over. But the test of Silas Croft had just been concluded. The holding cell at the courthouse was a study in institutional grey. The concrete walls, the metal bench, the thick, barred door, all painted the same shade of oppressive, soul-crushing neutrality. Clarice sat on the bench, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. The thrift store suit jacket was bunched around her. She was now a convicted felon. Her life, a fragile structure of paycheck-to-paycheck survival, had been a house of cards. She'd clawed her way out of the foster system, a system that had spat her out at 18 with a duffel bag and a bus pass. She'd worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, barista, night shift stocker, data entry, to save enough for a community college associate's degree. Getting the job at Thorne Analytics had felt like a miracle. A real office, a salary, health insurance. Marcus Thorne had seemed like a mentor, praising her meticulous work, her head for numbers. "You're going places, Clarice," he'd said, all teeth and charm. The setup had been insidious. It started 6 months ago. "Clarice, I need you to handle a sensitive client account," he'd said, closing his office door. "It's delicate. A high-profile individual. Needs to be off-book for privacy reasons. Just a temporary escrow." He'd had her create a series of shell accounts, calling them project buffers. He'd had her move money, reallocating funds. She'd questioned it once. "Mr. Thorne, this structure seems unusual. It's not compliant with our internal reporting." His smile had turned cold for a fraction of a second. "Clarice, in the real world, we deal with real-world problems. Compliance is for the grunts. Your executive track. I need to know if you're a problem solver or just a box checker." She, desperate to prove herself, had become the problem solver. She'd checked the boxes he'd told her to check, and when the auditors, called in by Thorne himself, had discovered the $1.2 million discrepancy, every digital footprint led directly and solely to Clarice Vance. The sensitive client accounts were empty, the money vanished, and Marcus Thorne had an airtight alibi. a keynote speech in Chicago, the day the final, largest transfer was made. An authorization, of course, that had come from Clarice's terminal. A key scraped in the lock. The heavy door swung open. It wasn't a guard. It was Arthur Pendleton. He stood in the doorway, the grey light of the cell seeming to bend around his expensive suit. He exuded an aura of such profound power that the armed guard behind him seemed like his personal assistant. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low baritone. He did not enter the cell, but addressed her from the threshold. Clarice looked up, her expression wary. "I have a lawyer. Mr. Harrison is a good man, but he is out of his depth," Pendleton replied, as if discussing the weather. "I am not here to offer legal counsel." "Who are you? You were at the trial every day." "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am an executor." "An executor? Of what?" "An estate, and, in a broader sense, an executor of a promise." He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that was subtle, and Clarice recognized from Thorne's boasts worth more than her old apartment. "Why are you here?" Pendleton met her gaze. His eyes were not unkind, but they were deeply assessing. "I am here to ask you, now that it is over, why you remained silent. You are an intelligent woman. You knew the evidence against you was strong. You knew your silence would be interpreted as guilt. Mr. Harrison told you as much. Yet you said nothing." Clarice stood up, a spark of her old fire returning. "And what did you want me to say? Did you want me to cry and beg? Did you want me to invent a better lie than his? Marcus Thorne owns the company. He owns the IT logs. He owns the lawyers. He built the cage, gave me the key, and then called the police, telling them I'd locked myself inside. What good would screaming have done?" She paused, taking a breath. "I didn't lie. I didn't create fake evidence. I didn't try to frame him back. I just stopped playing. It was his game, his rules. My silence was the only true thing I had left." Pendleton stared at her for a long, unbroken moment. The small, cold cell seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he nodded again. That same small, profound gesture from the courtroom. "As I thought," he said, almost to himself. "You have your grandmother's spine." "My grandmother? My grandmother died before I was born. I never knew her." "You know more of her than you think," said Pendleton. He stepped aside. "Your conviction, Miss Vance, is being vacated." "What?" Clarice's blood ran cold. "Is this another deal? Does Thorne want something else?" "Mr. Thorne is irrelevant. The district attorney's office has just received new, irrefutable evidence, a complete confession with full documentation from the actual party. The case against you has been dismissed with prejudice. All charges dropped. You are free to go." Clarice gripped the edge of the metal bench to steady herself. "A confession? From who? From Thorne?" "Not from Mr. Thorne. As I said, he is irrelevant. The party has requested anonymity. All that matters is that the system, which you so rightly identified as a game, has been corrected." The guard stepped forward. "Ma'am, you're being released. You can collect your personal effects at the front desk." Clarice couldn't move. She was free, just like that. The $1.2 million black hole that had swallowed her life had simply vanished. She looked at Pendleton, who was now walking away down the hall. "Wait," she called out. "Who are you? What just happened?" He paused, turning his head slightly. "A town car is waiting for you at the front entrance. It will take you to your apartment to collect your things. After that, your presence is required for a meeting." "A meeting? I don't understand." "You will, Miss Vance," Arthur Pendleton said, his voice echoing slightly in the corridor. My employer was very particular. He did not like to be kept waiting, and he hated liars. He turned the corner and was gone. Clarice was left in the echoing silence, a free woman who felt more captive to a mystery than she ever had in chains. The transition from the stale, recycled air of the courthouse basement to the crisp November air of lower Manhattan was a physical shock. Clarice stumbled out onto Center Street, blinking against the weak afternoon sun. The noise of the city, sirens, horns, the chatter of passers-by, hit her like a wave. She had been inside for only a few hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Her release had been processed with a speed that was both baffling and terrifying. And just as he'd said, a car was waiting. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement. A mirror-black Bentley Mulsanne, parked brazenly in a no-standing zone, its presence so dominant that the nearby traffic cops seemed to be actively ignoring it. The driver, a large man in a dark suit and earpiece, spotted her and immediately got out, walking around to open the rear passenger door. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice polite but firm. Clarice clutched the cheap plastic bag that held her personal effects. A single key, a tube of lip balm, and $17. "Where are we going?" "To your apartment first, Mum, to collect your belongings. Mr. Pendleton's instructions." She looked at the opulent leather interior. This car was worth more than a down payment on a house. "I don't think Mr. Pendleton was insistent, Miss Vance. He said to tell you, the test is over. It is time for the results." The test. That word again. Her entire trial. A test. A cold fury, purer and sharper than her earlier despair, began to burn in her stomach. She got in the car. The ride to her apartment in a rundown building in Astoria, Queens, was silent. The Bentley moved through the city traffic like a shark through water, other cars seeming to part for it. She lived on the 4th floor of a walk-up. The eviction notice she'd been dreading was taped to her door, stark and official. The driver waited at the bottom of the stairs. She had 20 minutes. Her apartment was small, furnished with items left by previous tenants and finds from the side of the road. It wasn't much, but it had been hers. She packed her few clothes, a handful of books, and a framed, faded photograph of a woman she'd been told was her mother. It was the only personal item she owned. She walked out of the building with a single, worn suitcase, leaving the eviction notice on the door. She was officially homeless. The driver took her bag, placing it in the trunk as if it were a priceless artifact. "Where to now?" Clarice asked, her voice hollow. "Midtown, Ma'am. The Croft building." Clarice's mind raced. Croft. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Croft Enterprises was a hydra of a corporation with tentacles in global shipping, real estate, pharmaceuticals, and private equity. Its founder, Silas Croft, was a notorious recluse, a billionaire phantom who hadn't been seen in public in over 2 decades. He was the New York equivalent of Howard Hughes, a legend of wealth and eccentricity. The Croft building was a spear of black glass and steel on Park Avenue, a monument to vertical power. The Bentley pulled not into the public entrance, but into a private, subterranean garage, the gates sliding shut behind them. Arthur Pendleton was waiting for them at the elevator bank. "Ms. Vance. Good. You're punctual." "I want answers," Clarice said, her voice shaking slightly, from anger or cold. She wasn't sure. "What was that in court? Who are you? And what does Silas Croft have to do with me?" "All your questions will be answered," Pendleton said, pressing a key into a private elevator lock. The button for the penthouse lit up. "The reading of my employer's last will and testament is scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. We must not be late. His last will? Clarice's heart skipped. Silas Croft. He's dead? Mr. Croft passed away peacefully 3 days ago, at the age of 91, Pendleton said, his voice betraying no emotion. His instructions were very clear. His will was not to be unsealed or read until the conclusion of your trial. The elevator doors opened onto a space that was less an office and more a palace in the sky. The walls were glass, offering a 360-degree, godlike view of Manhattan. The room was dominated by a single, massive mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine. And at the table sat the vultures, as Silas Croft had affectionately called them. There was Seraphina Croft Blackwood, Silas's niece, a severe woman in her 60s, with diamonds at her throat and a face tight with avarice. Beside her sat her brother, Julian Croft, a man in his late 50s who looked like he'd been pickled in expensive brandy. They were flanked by a team of shark-like lawyers from the white shoe firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. When Clarice and Pendleton entered, the room fell silent. Seraphina looked Clarice up and down, her lip curling in a visible sneer. "Arthur," Seraphina snapped, her voice like cracking ice. "We have been waiting. And what is this? Is this the catering staff? I specifically said no refreshments." "This," Pendleton said, pulling out the chair at the head of the table, directly opposite his own, "is Miss Clarice Vance. She is here at the explicit written request of Mr. Croft." Clarice, clutching her thin coat, sat down. She felt like a stray dog in a lion's den. The Croft lawyers began whispering furiously to each other. "A Vance?" Julian slurred slightly. "Don't know any Vances. Is she from the foundation? Did Uncle Silas leave a last-minute donation to the... what is it? The Home for Wayward Kittens?" "Be quiet, Julian," Seraphina hissed. "Arthur, this is highly irregular. This is a private family matter." "On the contrary, Seraphina," Pendleton said, placing a large, leather-bound document on the table and unfastening the clasps. "This is a private estate matter, and as of this moment, every person Silas wanted in this room is present." He cleared his throat, put on a pair of reading glasses, and began to read. "I, Silas Tiberius Croft, being of sound mind and body." The will began, as most do, with a dry, legalistic clearing of the throat. Arthur Pendleton's voice was a steady drone, outlining small bequests to long-serving staff, donations to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the full funding of a new research wing at Mount Sinai Hospital. Seraphina and Julian Croft looked monumentally bored. This was the preamble, the tedious noise before the real music. They were waiting for the good part, the distribution of the primary assets, the real estate portfolio, the art collection, and most importantly, the 51% controlling interest in Croft Enterprises. Clarice sat in a daze. The scale of the wealth being discussed was abstract, like astronomy. He was giving away billions as a warm-up. "To my niece, Seraphina Croft Blackwood," Pendleton read, "I leave my collection of 18th-century porcelain figurines in the hope that she may learn to appreciate things that are beautiful, silent, and entirely hollow." Seraphina's face went white. A small, strangled sound escaped her. "And to my nephew, Julian Croft, I leave a lifetime's membership to the New York Athletic Club and a monthly stipend of $5,000 to be contingent upon his verified, continuous sobriety. If he fails, the stipend is to be replaced by a one-time gift of a very fine bottle of 1945 Romanée Conti, which he may use to drink himself into a long-overdue oblivion." Julian's face purpled. The nerve. "Arthur!" Seraphina shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "This is a joke. He was senile. This is absurd." "It is a validly executed holographic will, signed witnessed and notarized Serafina. He was in full command of his faculties, Pendleton said calmly. And he was not finished. He turned a page. Now, for the main body of my estate. The remainder of my holdings, including all cash assets, all real estate, domestic and international, my complete art collection, and my 51% controlling interest in Croft Enterprises, I leave in its entirety to one person. The room was so quiet, Clarice could hear the air moving through the vents. Serafina was leaning forward, her eyes wide, a twisted smile forming. She clearly thought this was a final, dramatic flourish before naming her. Pendleton looked up, directly at Clarice. I leave everything to Ms. Clarice Vance. The words hit the room like a bomb. For a full 10 seconds there was no sound at all. Then Serafina erupted. It was not a scream. It was a shriek, a sound of pure primal rage. Who? Clarice Vance! Julian sputtered, pointing a shaking finger. Her! It's a trick! She's a fraud! Arthur, you've been compromised. This is elder abuse. He's not finished, Pendleton said, his voice rising, cutting through the chaos. He held up a hand. Mr. Croft included a final, personal addendum. He asked that I read it aloud. He cleared his throat and read, his voice now taking on a new, more personal tone. It was as if Silas Croft himself was speaking in the room. To my family, you are a disappointment. You were born on third base and think you hit a triple. You value nothing because you have earned nothing. You have been waiting for me to die for 30 years. I have decided to make you wait a little longer. You will not see a single dollar of my real money. To Miss Vance, you do not know me, but I have known you your entire life. Your grandmother, Eleanor Hayes, was the only woman I ever loved. My family, the same collection of leeches sitting before you today, deemed her unsuitable. A poor telegraph operator's daughter. They forced us apart, and I, in my cowardice, let them. It was the great and only regret of my life. I married for status, and lived in a prison of my own making. Clarice's head was spinning. Eleanor Hayes. That was the name on the back of the faded photograph in her suitcase. I lost track of Eleanor after she married another, Pendleton continued reading. I only found out years later that she had a daughter, your mother, who passed away so young. And I found you, a baby already lost in the state system. I am ashamed to say I watched you from afar. I could have intervened. I could have plucked you from that life. But what would that have proven? That money can buy anything. I had already learned that lesson. I needed to know if she was still in you, if Eleanor's strength, her integrity, her core of steel had passed to you. I saw you get a job at Thorn Analytics, a company I own through 3 layers of shell corporations. I saw Marcus Thorn, a man I keep on the payroll specifically because he is a moral vacuum, begin his pathetic little scheme to frame you. Clarice stopped breathing. So I decided to conduct a test. I gave Thorn the rope, and he, predictably, used it. I instructed my people to build the perfect, unwinnable case against you. I wanted to see what you would do. Would you lie? Would you fabricate your own evidence? Would you, as the district attorney offered you, take a plea deal to falsely testify against Thorn's superiors? Would you, in short, become them to save yourself? But you did not. You sat in that courtroom, and you faced the abyss with nothing but your own stubborn, magnificent integrity. You refused to lie. You refused to play the game. You chose to lose everything rather than forfeit the one thing that matters. In that courtroom, you were silent, and your silence was the loudest, most beautiful sound I have ever heard. It was the sound of your grandmother. It was the sound of character. The trial, Miss Vance, was your inheritance. You passed. The fortune is merely the paperwork." Pendleton looked up. Clarice was weeping, silent tears streaming down her face. Serafina and Julian were ashen-faced, statues of apoplectic shock. "The entire conviction was a fabrication," Clarice whispered, the full, monstrous weight of it hitting her. "The evidence, the guilty verdict." "The guilty verdict was the final part of the test," Pendleton said, closing the binder. "Silas needed to see you at the absolute bottom, when you had lost everything, when you were found guilty and a bailiff was approaching you with handcuffs. He needed to know that even then you would not break. You would not curse the judge. You would not scream. You would remain you." The order to vacate the conviction was already signed by the district attorney, who is a personal friend of the Croft estate, before the jury even read the verdict. The new evidence was delivered to his office the second the gavel fell. You were never, ever going to spend a single night in jail. Mr. Croft was an eccentric, Miss Vance. He was not a monster. "This is insane," Julian whispered, finally grasping it. "He put this child through a fake criminal trial? For money?" "No, Mr. Croft," Clarice said, finding her voice. She stood up, wiping her face. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear. "He put me through it to prove I wasn't you." She looked at Serafina's enraged, diamond-encrusted face. She looked at Julian's weak, trembling pout. And then she looked at Arthur Pendleton. "Mr. Pendleton," Clarice said. "What happens now?" Arthur Pendleton allowed himself the smallest, briefest of smiles. "Now, Miss Croft, we get to work." The days that followed were a blur of disorientation and power. Clarice Vance, the convicted felon, was gone. In her place was Clarice Vance Croft, the sole heiress to an empire worth an estimated $38 billion. The media firestorm was immediate and blinding. Tabloid reporters, led by a particularly bloodthirsty journalist named Brent Paxton, swarmed her. The story was too perfect. "From cellmate to Cinderella," screamed the New York Post. "The billionaire's secret test," bellowed the dailies. Clarice was moved by a discreet and highly trained security team, from her old life into the penthouse of the Croft building, Silas's former home. It was a sterile, silent space, a 10,000-square-foot mausoleum of glass, steel, and priceless, untouchable art. From her windows, she could see all of New York, yet she had never felt more isolated. The first few days, she did nothing but sit on a $100,000 sofa and stare at a genuine Mark Rothko painting, a vast canvas of swirling, moody reds. She was rich, she was free, and she was furious. "He played with my life," she said, her voice echoing in the vast room. Arthur Pendleton, who was now her chief advisor, chief of staff, and seemingly her only link to reality, was sitting opposite her, nursing a cup of tea. "He secured your future," Pendleton corrected gently. "He let me believe I was going to prison. I was fingerprinted. I was put in a cell. I heard a jury call me guilty. Do you have any idea what that does to a person?" "He had to be certain," Pendleton said, his face unreadable. "A fortune this size is not a gift. It is a weapon, a burden, and a target. He had to know you could carry it. He had to know you wouldn't be them." Them. Serafina and Julian. They had not gone away quietly. The day after the will reading, they had filed a lawsuit to contest the will, claiming undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. Their lawyers, the Sharks from Sullivan and Cromwell, had immediately filed a motion for an emergency injunction to freeze all of Silas's assets, pending the outcome. "They are claiming you and I conspired to defraud a senile old man," Pendleton said, looking at a document on his tablet. "They are claiming the trial was a deranged fantasy, and that you, Miss Vance, are a con artist of unparalleled skill who seduced your way into the will." Clarice laughed, a bitter, dry sound. "Seduce? I was in a holding cell. They are also, and this is more concerning, leaking information to the press, specifically to Mr. Paxton." A new story had just dropped online. It featured a source close to the family who claimed that Marcus Thorne, the ex-boss, was now telling a new story. Clarice read the article. Thorne, his reputation now in tatters after the revelation that his company was a mere puppet of Croft Enterprises, was singing. He claimed Clarice wasn't innocent. He claimed she had been in on a separate, real scheme to defraud the company, and that Silas Croft had only bailed her out at the last minute because of a senile infatuation with her grandmother. He claimed the test was a cover story. "He's lying," Clarice said, her stomach twisting. "Of course he is," Pendleton said. "He's a cornered animal. Serafina and Julian likely paid him a great deal of money for this new, convenient truth. It's a classic pincer movement. They attack the will in court and attack your character in the press. They hope to make this so ugly, so public, that you will be forced to settle. Give them a few billion to go away." "And will I?" Clarice asked. "That is for you to decide. You are the sole signatory on the estate." Clarice looked out the window. Down below, the city moved, tiny cars and tiny people, all blissfully unaware. She thought about her old life, the dread of the first of the month, the constant grinding fear of a single unexpected expense, a broken-down subway, a dental emergency, and she thought about the trial, the feeling of absolute powerlessness. "No," she said, turning from the window. "I won't settle. He put me through that fire for a reason. He wanted to know if I had a spine. He's about to find out." Her voice had changed. The wavering, hollow tone was gone. In its place was something cold, hard, and sharp. It was the sound of a CEO. "Arthur," she said, "call a full emergency meeting of the board of directors of Croft Enterprises. Tomorrow morning. I want Serafina and Julian there. I want the entire executive committee. And I want Marcus Thorne." Pendleton raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Thorne is no longer an employee. He has no standing. He is a material witness in a lawsuit against the controlling shareholder. Get him a subpoena. Make him attend via video link if you have to. I want him in that meeting. May I ask what you intend to do, Miss Vance?" Clarice walked over to the vast, empty desk that had been Silas's. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool wood. "Silas tested my character. Now I'm going to test my power. I was silent in court because I had no other choice. But in that boardroom, I am not going to be silent." The boardroom at Croft Enterprises was on the 80th floor, 2 levels below the penthouse. It was a vast, intimidating space, dominated by a table that looked like it had been carved from a single ancient tree. The view was, as always, spectacular. The board members, 10 of the most powerful and ruthless individuals in New York finance, were already seated. They were Silas's old guard, men and women in their 60s and 70s, all of whom looked at Clarice with a mixture of curiosity, pity, and naked skepticism. This was the child who had inherited the kingdom? Serafina and Julian were at the far end of the table, flanked by their lead attorney. They looked confident, almost smug. They believed this meeting was their opening salvo in a long, drawn-out war. They believed Clarice had called them there to offer a settlement. Arthur Pendleton sat at Clarice's right hand. Clarice herself took the seat at the head of the table, Silas's seat. She was wearing a simple, custom-made black dress, her hair pulled back. She looked young, yes, but she no longer looked like a victim. "Good morning," Clarice said. Her voice, aided by the room's advanced acoustics, was clear and steady. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know there are questions about the recent transition. I am here to answer them." "Ms. Vance," Serafina's lawyer began, "my clients have filed a legitimate legal challenge. This meeting is improper." "Your challenge is noted, Mr. Heiress," Clarice said, cutting him off cleanly. "But as of today, I am the sole, voting, controlling shareholder of this company. This meeting is not improper. It is a directive. Please sit." The lawyer, stunned at being so easily dismissed, sat. "We have a problem," Clarice continued. "We have a lawsuit that is a distraction, and we have a former employee, Mr. Marcus Thorne, who is making slanderous, damaging statements to the press, in concert with members of this very board." She looked directly at Serafina, who glared back. "Mr. Pendleton, please bring Mr. Thorne into the meeting." A large screen on the wall flickered to life. Marcus Thorne appeared, sitting in what looked like a lavish home office. He looked startled, as if he'd been expecting a one-on-one call. "Mr. Thorne," Clarice said, her voice friendly. "Thank you for joining us." "I'm here," he snapped, "against the advice of my counsel." "What is this?" "This is an opportunity for clarity," Clarice said. "You've been telling the press that my test was a cover story, that I was, in fact, guilty of a different crime. Is that correct?" Thorne, seeing Serafina on the screen, gained confidence. "That's right. You were playing your own game. You were siphoning money long before I—" He stopped. "Long before you framed me for the crime you did commit," Clarice offered sweetly. "This is a farce," Serafina shouted. "She's a liar. She's admitting it." "I'm admitting nothing," Clarice said, her voice dropping, losing its warmth. "I'm clarifying. Mr. Thorne, you are a very good liar. Your lies in court were almost perfect, but you're not a very good accountant." Thorne's face froze. "You see, when you gave me access to those off-book escrow accounts, you forgot that I'm meticulous. You forgot that I was a data entry clerk before this, and my job was to see patterns. I kept a private log, a backup." She motioned to Pendleton. He tapped a key on his laptop. The large screen split. On one side was Thorne. On the other, a complex spreadsheet appeared. "This," Clarice said, "is Mr. Thorne's real side hustle, not the $1.2 million he framed me for. That was pocket change. This is a 5-year, $40 million scheme, siphoning money from Croft Enterprises' own R&D budget into a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a company called Seraphim Holdings." Serafina Croft Blackwood's face went a shade of grey Clarice had only ever seen in the courthouse holding cell. "Seraphim," Clarice mused. "Like Serafina. That's rather poetic, don't you think? You weren't just framing me to cover your tracks, Marcus. You were framing me at her direction. A neat little 2-for-1. You get to cover your own $40 million theft, and she gets to eliminate a potential rival to the throne she didn't even know existed yet. She just knew Silas was watching me, so she had you get rid of me by sending me to prison." The boardroom was utterly silent. The other board members were staring, horrified at Serafina. This is slander," Serafina whispered, her voice high and thin. "Is it?" Clarice asked. "Mr. Thorne, you'll find that my private log, including the 4:05 p.m. email from March 12th, where you accidentally CC'd me on a wire transfer confirmation to your partner in the Caymans, has been in the possession of the SEC and the Southern District of New York for approximately 1 hour. Mr. Pendleton arranged the delivery. On the screen, Marcus Thorne's face had collapsed. He was a ruined man. I was silent in court, Marcus, because my public defender told me not to muddy the waters. He said your $40 million fraud was a separate case. It wasn't relevant to the $1.2 million I was on trial for. He said we couldn't prove it. Clarice leaned forward. But I'm not in court anymore, and I don't need a public defender. I am the proof. I am the sole shareholder of the company you both defrauded. She looked at Serafina. Your lawsuit is dismissed. You will renounce all claims to the estate, or the full weight of Croft Enterprises will join the SDNY in a criminal prosecution against you and your brother, who I'm sure was a knowing beneficiary. Julian looked like he was about to be sick. You're out, Clarice said, her voice flat. Both of you. Your board seats are rescinded. Your access to all Croft properties is revoked. Security will see you out. Serafina stood up, her entire body trembling with a rage so profound it was silent. She didn't speak. She just stared at Clarice with eyes full of hatred. Then, she and a weeping Julian were escorted from the room. The screen with Marcus Thorne went black. He had, presumably, gone to find a lawyer. Clarice turned back to the remaining, stunned board members. Silas Croft tested my character, she said, her voice quiet again. Today you have all seen it. My apologies for the theatricality. But I believe in clarity. Croft Enterprises is no longer a den of thieves. It is not a personal piggy bank. It is a business, and I am its owner. She stood up. I have a great deal to learn, and I will. But know this, I do not lie, and I do not tolerate liars. The games are over. She walked out of the boardroom, leaving a room full of the most powerful people in New York, sitting in stunned, respectful silence. In the 6 months that followed, Clarice Vance Croft remade the empire. But she did not remake it in Silas's image or her own. She remade it in her grandmother's. Her first act as CEO was not a hostile takeover or a corporate restructuring. It was a phone call. She found David Harrison, her old public defender, working late in his cluttered, fluorescent-lit office. She walked in unannounced, and he nearly fell out of his chair. Ms. Vance? Croft? Your Highness, he'd stammered. Mr. Harrison, she said, smiling, you've redecorated. That night she wrote him a check. Not for him, but from him. She established the Eleanor Hayes Foundation for a Just Defense, with an initial endowment of $500 million, its sole simple mission to provide top-tier, private legal defense, the kind of defense only billionaires can afford, to any public defender-represented client in New York City who was facing a plea deal for a crime they insisted they did not commit. She partnered with real-world organizations like the Innocence Project and the Legal Aid Society, pouring money into DNA testing, forensic accounting, and investigative journalism. She didn't just throw money at the problem. She was at the Foundation's office 3 days a week. She read the cases. She remembered the faces. She had been one of them. She was the only person in the world who had sat on both sides of the table, the accused and the accuser. The press, led by a now chastened Brent Paxton, who had become her most fawning admirer, changed their tune. Cinderella was dropped. They started calling her the Iron Heiress. She was ruthless in her new life. She liquidated Serafina's beloved porcelain figurines and Julian's wine collection, including the 1945 Romanée Conti, and used the proceeds to build a state-of-the-art rehab facility in Queens, which she named after Julian, in honor of his struggle. She found Marcus Thorne. He was awaiting sentencing, his life in ruins. She visited him not in a holding cell, but in a sterile lawyer's conference room. He looked at her, defeated. "Come to gloat." "No," Clarice said. "I'm here to offer you a job. When you get out." "What?" "My foundation. I need an advisor on white-collar crime. Someone who knows exactly how the corrupt system works, how to spot a fake ledger, how to build a perfect, fraudulent case." Thorne stared at her. "You're serious?" "It's a test," Clarice said, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. "I've become rather fond of them. It's your one chance at redemption. Or you can rot. It's your choice." Her final loose end was Serafina. She had vanished from New York society. Clarice found her living in a modest, rented apartment in Westchester, her assets frozen, her reputation destroyed. Clarice met her at a simple coffee shop, not as a billionaire, but as a woman. Serafina looked old and tired. The hatred was gone, replaced by a dull resentment. "What do you want, Clarice? To watch me drink cheap coffee?" "I wanted to understand why," Clarice said. "Why me? You didn't even know me. Why try to destroy me?" Serafina sighed, stirring her coffee. "Because he watched you. For years. I saw the reports from his private investigators. Clarice bought groceries. Clarice paid her community college tuition. He was obsessed. Not with you, but with her. With Eleanor. He spent his whole life trying to get back a ghost." She looked at Clarice. "You weren't a person. You were a symbol of his one great failure. And when he started his test, I knew. I knew he was going to give you everything. Because he wasn't testing you. He was testing us. And he set us up to fail, just as he set you up to win." "He gave you every advantage," Clarice said quietly. "You were born a Croft." "And you were born a Hayes," Serafina countered. "In his eyes, that was the only begotten name. We never stood a chance." Clarice finished her coffee. She placed a small, simple key on the table. "It's a house," Clarice said. "In the country. It's not a palace. It's where my grandmother was born. Silas bought it, but never lived there. It's in your name now. There's a trust, enough to live on. Comfortably, but not extravagantly." Serafina stared at the key. "Why?" "Because Silas tested my integrity," Clarice said. "He tested your greed. He tested Thorne's corruption. Everyone was tested, but no one ever tested his compassion. I guess that's my inheritance to figure out." Clarice stood up. "The games are over, Serafina, for all of us." She walked out of the coffee shop, leaving the last ghosts of the Croft family behind. She returned to her penthouse, but it was no longer a sterile cage. It was a command center. She stood at the window, looking out at the city. She was no longer the silent girl in the courtroom. Her silence had been her armor. Now, her voice was her weapon, and she was finally, just now, learning how to use it. In the end, Clarice Vance's story wasn't about the money. It was about the silence. We all have moments where the world demands we speak, to lie, to bend, to compromise just to survive. But Clarice's story is a testament to the staggering power of integrity. She proved that you don't have to be loud to be strong. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of character, full of strength, and ultimately, full of a value that no bank account could ever measure. She was put through an impossible test, but the real test is what she did after. She didn't just take the money. She took the responsibility. She turned her pain into a shield for others, ensuring that no one else would have to face the system, silent and alone, ever again. What did you think of Clarice's incredible journey from the courtroom to the boardroom? What would you have done in her place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love stories where the underdog finds their power, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a story of true strength, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. We have so many more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one.